Okay, the sermon's about awakeness, so does anybody need to do like a seventh inning stretch? You can. It's time. Wake yourself up. Live Alert Awake enthusiastic. So for the next few months, we will be preaching the gospel of the present moment. The present moment, fully awake and alive to it. We will delve into a season that invites darkness, that looks towards coziness, yes, as Danielle described and invited us into, and also encourages lighting the lamp within as the nights lengthen and the leaves fall, teaching us not to cling so hard to what has been, but to let go a little bit. Monk Thomas Merton said, "The kingdom of heaven is within you." The kingdom of heaven is within you. You know, it's strange. When there's a building to be renovated, there's this enormous group project. It gives one a sense of purpose and clarity of mission. And this sense of purpose, it is sharp enough to slice through the doldrums of deep pandemic. Yes, it is. I can tell you from personal experience. This holy call arrives with an engine that can power through scarcity mindset, all kinds of the despair of mass death, even fear of nuclear war, and all kinds of major events that would otherwise leave one feeling a bit splintered, aimless, languishing. It really has been a time of powering through, though. I mean, what other choice was there, really? I remember those days I could close my eyes and I could see this place filling up with all of us, just up as it is today. I could see it up ahead like a flashing billboard with the sign, "Rest Stop Ahead." But here's the thing about adulthood in the 21st century, at least as I have experienced it. That sign that reads, "Rest Stop Ahead," stays about 10 miles up the road forever. You never seem to reach it. And I remember almost the moment I entered adulthood and I left behind me a spiritual sleepiness, or perhaps it was just a shallowness, just skirting the shallows of the world and my life in it, where my life had largely been one of comfort and being able to expect that things would continue on the trajectory they always had. It was 1999, and I was living in Guadalajara, Mexico. Has anyone been to Guadalajara? It's a beautiful place. Okay, a few people. I was living there in a study abroad program my college had developed with the University of Guadalajara. Like most Mexican cities, the wealthiest in the city lived in the most central neighborhood, and the farther you got from the center, the more poverty you would encounter, until you came to the outer rings of the city, right up against La Barranca, the huge canyon. And you would find people there living under tarps in huts they had made, no running water or serviceable roads out there. And for the first half of the semester, I lived with a host family that was well established by the university, a woman and her brother who lived in a fine apartment in the center of the city, just a few blocks from school, so I could walk. They cooked for me and my roommate, and after breakfast, they'd sit in their kitchen and smoke while watching telenovelas. And after classes, twice a week, our cohort from our college would travel out to the outer barrios to meet with members of a grassroots organization called Intercolonias. Still exists. These were folks who were organizing for better municipal services for those outer neighborhoods. Many of them lived there. And each week, we would meet in a different barrio, a different neighborhood, encountering poverty of one degree or another. This neighborhood had roads but no running water. This one had electricity but no real roads. And we would gather together and read and discuss a chapter each week of Paulo Freire's seminal book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. We would do this in both English and Spanish. During the day, At school, we learned about the effects of globalization and colonization by America upon the Mexican economy. We learned about the symbiotic relationship between North and Central America, the way United States economy functions largely on the indentured servitude of migrant farm workers and other low-wage labor. Meanwhile, the United States government also trained puppet governments across Central America to destabilize economies and maintain its own dominance across the two continents. And as time went on, as I was learning this, I deepened my relationships with these activists, friends now, who were living in the outer neighborhoods. And I came to realize that my presence as an exchange student could be a valuable source of income for them. And as I learned more, as I went out into these barrios, I would experience the smells, the sounds, the sights, the tastes of these different neighborhoods. The one in the center where I was staying, and the one out in the outskirts where they lived. And it hit me. My whole life, I had lived in the center of every concentric circle, oblivious to the oppression that I was either directly or indirectly inflicting upon surrounding communities. I thought I had been a neutral person. But all the comforts I enjoyed were related to the discomfort and the oppression of others. This was my awakening, you see. And 2 months in, I asked my program if I could move in with a family who I had befriended in one of the outer neighborhoods, and they allowed it. So I moved out to a colonia with a family that was much larger, lots of children, full of vibrance and verve. I awoke to hear the gas man coming down the street each morning. El gas. It was really loud on a loudspeaker. El gas. That was an awakening, definitely. And I helped with family chores, which basically consisted of running to different houses to pick up various goods in the sharing economy of that neighborhood that lacked a grocery store. Every Friday and Saturday, we gathered in someone's yard for a simple meal, and somehow most of the men played guitar and sang mariachi songs until late into the night. And each morning, I'd walk to a neighbor's house across the street for a hot shower and return to my host family for breakfast. And it wasn't until the semester ended and I moved out that I realized something. Okay, here comes some dusty old shame. Not fresh, but not gone. My host parents in that outer colonia, they had been sleeping in a room with one of their children. The father of the patriarch slept on a mattress on the floor, and matriarch, who cooked for me, slept on a twin mattress on the floor while I slept in their marital bedroom during the 3 months of my stay. Furthermore, I shamed them by walking to their neighbor's house to take a warm shower. Rather than the stove-heated sponge bath the rest of the family used to clean themselves. And in my privilege, I had not even noticed these details or what they meant. I just knew I wanted a nice big bed and a warm shower, and I felt entitled to these things, even though my host family really did not have them to offer me. And they never would have mentioned the ways I had put them out, never would have mentioned it. But once I knew, once I understood how I was participating actively, how my shower was political and my bed was, I suddenly wanted to learn even more about Mexican-American politics and history. I wanted to become a force of humanization for immigrants, to tell the stories of hospitality and love amidst great poverty and degradation of a people who live so close to us, they can almost reach us, but not quite. Everything about my life in America suddenly became an embarrassment. And I remember my host family would ask me to tell them stories about a palace of foods where you could go back for more again and again, buffet de China, they called it. And in my embarrassment, I became awakened and alert to the histories and dynamics that created the cycles of poverty and oppression that I was a part of. I realized none of it was neutral, and it was all by design. It was a wake-up call, and I thank God for them, that family, for that experience, and for my shame, which allowed me to see more than I was seeing before. It is the first source of our Unitarian Universalist faith that I draw from as I wake myself up to what is going on, all the dynamics. It is that first source, direct experience of that transcending mystery and wonder, affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces which create and uphold life. So I ask you, this might be another time to stretch. What is keeping you spiritually sleepy? Is it addiction? Is it scrolling headlines? Yeah, go ahead, stretch. Is it passive consumerism of your faith journey? What are you missing in the larger picture and your place in it? All the compulsions that we take on to get ourselves through a deeply anxious time, they are all understandable. They make us feel more in control in a chaotic world. So I want to give us some grace too. And I want you to know that I will also be preaching about holy rest, just not today. Because rest is holy. And there is a time for rest, which is actually all part of being awake. You do not need to know precisely what is happening or where it is all going. What you need to recognize is the possibility and challenge offered by the present moment, and embrace them both with courage, faith, and hope. This from Thomas Merton again. These days, I think what keeps me spiritually sleepy is busyness, actually. The ministry of doing, less the ministry of being. The ministry of doing, which keeps me overwhelmed and far apart from my spiritual center, distance from spirit and from myself. For many of us, perhaps it is cynicism and despair that have embedded themselves in our hearts. Or maybe we are just passively expecting and hoping everything to get back to normal or continue as it always was. But we need to wake up spiritually and awaken our senses. I mean, waking up, this is a big deal. It's a big deal even in Scripture. God says it over and over, wake up. Jesus says it at the end of his life. Do you remember in the Garden of Gethsemane? And he says to his disciples, do you think you could stay awake tonight, my last night, and pray with me, even just for an hour or two, just for a minute? And could they? I said, could they? No. It was like they had narcolepsy. They kept falling asleep. They're always falling asleep in this story. It's literally a spiritual sleepiness. They cannot face this terrible reality. Their teacher is afraid and in need of prayer, and they cannot stay awake to the situation. Religious speaker Danielle Strickland tells a story of driving home late at night, one night from work. She's driving on a highway in a Canadian winter, and she's falling asleep at the wheel. She realizes this and starts to turn the music up too loud. She tries to stay awake. She starts pinching herself. It never really occurs to her to pull over. I asked her this about the story. She needed to get where she was going. She's falling asleep and she's kind of slapping herself, smacking herself a little bit, and she finally does the thing every Canadian knows not to do in the dead of winter, late at night, and she rolls down the window. Sticks her head out the window, and she is hit with an icy blast. I mean, crystals form immediately on her eyelashes. That's how cold. She's freezing now, but finally alert enough to make it home. And in order to stay awake, we must willfully embrace some discomfort. That's what she says. I told Sally I'd be preaching about the virtues of discomfort. So here we go. So you got to put yourself in a place of discomfort, which is awakening agent. And the more you lean in, the more you kind of ask to be woken and alert to what is happening. The motivational speaker Bob Goff talks a lot about the number of Bobs that exist in his life. He says, first, there was Bob number 1. As a kid, he was coming to know, when he was growing up, coming to know the Jesus his parents knew. That was Bob number 1. And then he says, when he does his speeches, he says, let me tell you about Bob number 2. When he was falling in love with his girlfriend, who later became his wife. And then he says, let me tell you about Bob number 3. Bob number 3 was a high-powered lawyer, big achiever, made tons of money. But then let me tell you about Bob number 4. He says, that's the guy who left his job, gave it all up, and went out to help the world and help people try to make meaning out of their lives. Now he's 60, he says. He's on Bob number 6. And he says, I think there's going to be a whole lot more Bobs to come. And this is who he feels really sorry for. He says he feels sorry for people who are still on self number 1. We are on a journey of discovery, this wide, boundless life. I mean, it opens into eternity. Even we who are weary, we can arise, sleeper, and wake to that which matters most. And I want to be joined in this project of curiosity and wonderment, because that's what we need to be spiritually awake. To be constantly asking the question, who is not with us? What am I missing? I long for us all to be people of wide-eyed wonderment, to be unsatisfied with what we know, and relentlessly curious about all we cannot imagine. You know the theory of knowledge management? There's what you already know. Well, that's like less than 10% of what is knowable. And then there's the stuff you don't know. Well, that's the other 90% of knowledge. And when we get curious, open, and ready for change, we expand our 10% further out into the 90%. I mean, we are reaching out into the void, into the eternal, expanding our consciousness. And this is magical. I mean, if we can awaken to all we do not know, we could just keep growing forever. It's that moment when we realize we have caused someone harm. When we realize that what we were doing was political all along. It's when we understand all of our actions are political. How you sitting in this chair right now, where you sit and how you're sitting, what you chose to wear to church today, it's all political. And no one ever changes because they are comfortable. That's why we've got to open the window and feel the sting of that fresh air on our faces and taste a little discomfort. Because what gets us through times of weariness is being called to something greater than ourselves. That group project that I talked about earlier. So here's a question for you, just to think about, maybe think about it later as you go on with your day. What was the single most transformative moment in your life? If you could think back, if you could choose one. Specifically, what changed in your life after that? And what led up to it? Probably wasn't feelings of comfort that led up to the transformation. There are two, and it's difficult to talk about awakening without quoting Reverend Dr. King, who said it all in his famous speech, Staying Awake Through the Revolution. So now we're going to hear a little bit of King, and then we're going to wrap it up, I promise. He said in this speech, he said, there are too many people who, in some great period of social change, failed to achieve the new mental outlooks that the new situation demands. There is nothing more tragic than to sleep through a revolution, and the wind of change is blowing. Wherever people are assembled today, the cry is always the same. We want to be free. And so we see in our own world a revolution of rising expectations. The great challenge facing every individual today is to remain awake through this social revolution. And let nobody give you the impression, King says, that the problem of racial injustice will work itself out. Let nobody give you the impression that only time will solve the problem. That is a myth. And it is a myth because time is neutral. It can be used either constructively or destructively. And King said this long ago, and I think it definitely applies to today. He said, "I am absolutely convinced that the people of ill will in our nation, the extreme rightists," he said, "the forces committed to negative ends, have used time much more effectively than the people of goodwill. It may well be that we will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the vitriolic works and the violent actions of the bad people who bomb a church in Birmingham or shoot down a civil rights worker in Selma, but for the appalling silence, for the indifference of good people who sit around and say, wait on time. Somewhere we must come to see that human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and the persistent work of dedicated individuals. And without this hard work, time becomes an ally of the primitive forces of social stagnation. So we must help time and realize that the time is always right to do right. You know that part? We must help time and realize that the time is always right to do right. So that's from MLK. At the very least, I want to be sure every one of us here is awake to the fact that there is an election in 3 weeks, and we need to go above and beyond our part to wake our fellow citizens up to the issues that will affect all of our lives and our futures. The threat to human dignity and freedom is as real now as it was in King's time. So we are preaching the gospel of the present moment, to see things as they are and not as we would wish them to be, to fight the spiritual sleepiness that would turn us away from the reality we are in and keep us apart and isolated from our collective power. Just imagine a community fully alive, alert, awake, enthusiastic, ready to join the revolution, armed with holy curiosity and revolutionary love. Imagine what world we could create. May it be so. Amen.